The house looked exactly the same from the outside. That's the thing that gets me, even now. I pulled into the driveway after 11 days away, and everything looked perfectly normal. The mailbox was by the road. The oak tree in the front yard had dropped a few leaves onto the lawn. My father's old Ford pickup was parked exactly where it always sat, slightly crooked, the way he'd parked it for 30 years because the driveway had a crack he never bothered to fix. Everything looked fine. I remember sitting in my car for a moment before going in. I was tired from the drive 7 hours from Raleigh, and I was trying to decompose before I walked through the door. My wife, Carol, had told me to take a breath before I went in. She knew how these trips affected me. She knew how hard it was to be away from my father for that long, especially with his condition. My father had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease 2 years earlier. Nothing severe enough to require a full-time nurse. Not yet, but enough that he needed help. Help with medications. Help with meals. Help getting up in the morning and getting to bed at night. He was 78 years old and stubborn as a fence post, but his hands shook badly enough now that he couldn't always hold a cup of coffee without spilling it. He would never admit that to anyone, but I'd seen it. I'd seen the way he gripped things tighter than he needed to, like he was fighting his own body every single moment. I was the one who helped him. I'd moved back to Millbrook, Tennessee 3 years earlier specifically for that reason. Gave up a good management job in Raleigh. Carol and I rented out our house there and moved into a small place 4 miles from my father's house on Crescent Ridge Road. It was the right thing to do. He'd raised me alone after my mother passed, worked double shifts at the mill for years so I could have what I needed. Taking care of him wasn't a burden. It was just what you do. My brother Dennis was a different story. Dennis was 4 years younger than me. He lived in Knoxville, 2 hours away. He called my father on birthdays and occasionally on Sunday afternoons when he had nothing better to do. He showed up at Christmas with a nice bottle of bourbon and a lot of loud laughter, and my father lit up every time because Dennis had always been the charmer, always the one who could make the whole room smile. I was the steady one, the responsible one, the one who actually showed up, but Dennis was the one who made my father laugh, and I'd accepted that dynamic a long time ago. When my wife's sister was in a car accident in Raleigh, Carol flew out immediately. The accident was serious enough that Carol needed to be there. Her sister had 2 young kids and her husband traveled for work. I told Carol I'd follow in a few days once I got my father settled. I arranged his medications in a weekly pill organizer. I stocked his refrigerator. I left a list of instructions on the kitchen counter, his doctor's number, the pharmacy number, what he needed to take and when, what he could and couldn't eat with his blood thinners. And I called Dennis. I want to be honest about that phone call, because I've replayed it 1,000 times. I asked Dennis if he could come stay with our father for about a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks. I told him I'd cover his gas, cover whatever food he bought. Dennis said, of course, no problem, anything for Dad, don't worry about a thing. He sounded genuinely happy to do it. He asked about Carol's sister, said he hoped she recovered quickly. He told me to drive safe. I left the next morning. For the first week, things seemed fine. I texted Dennis every day and he responded. Short messages, but they came. He's good. Had eggs this morning. Watched the game last night. That kind of thing. I called my father twice and he sounded like himself, a little slow, a little quiet, but that was normal. He told me Dennis had made his chili recipe and it wasn't as good as mine, and I laughed and told him I'd make it when I got back. On day 8, the text from Dennis stopped. I didn't panic immediately. Dennis had always been flaky about his phone. I called him and it went to voicemail. I called again that evening. Voicemail again. I texted. No response. I told myself he was probably just busy. Probably out running errands for my father. Probably just had the phone on silent. I called my father's landline. No answer. I called again the next morning. No answer. By the afternoon of day 9, I was already packing my car. Carol told me to call the neighbors first. We had an understanding with the Pattersons next door. Good people, retired couple. They'd known my father for 20 years. I called Patricia Patterson and asked if she'd seen any activity at the house. She paused in a way that made my stomach drop before she even said a word. She said she hadn't seen Dennis's car in the driveway since at least Wednesday. She said she'd noticed the lights weren't coming on in the evenings the way they usually did. She said she'd waved at the house a couple times but hadn't actually seen my father come outside. I was on the road within the hour. I drove those 7 hours with my hands tight on the wheel and my mind doing things I didn't want it to do. I kept telling myself there was a reasonable explanation. My father had probably gone to stay with a friend. Maybe Dennis had taken him somewhere and just forgotten to tell me. Maybe the phone situation was a simple misunderstanding and they were both sitting in the living room watching television and everything was perfectly fine and I was overreacting. I kept telling myself that the whole way there. I pulled up to the house at just past 9 in the evening. The porch light wasn't on. The inside of the house was dark. My father's pickup was still in the driveway. Dennis's car was gone. I used my key to get in. I turned the lights on as I went and called out for my father. The kitchen was a mess, dishes in the sink, a half-empty box of crackers on the counter, a carton of milk that had been left out. The pill organizer I'd left on the counter was sitting exactly where I'd put it, and when I looked at it I felt the first real wave of cold fear move through me. The compartments for the past 4 days were still full. He hadn't taken his medications in 4 days. I went to his bedroom. He was in bed. He was conscious, barely. And when he turned his head toward the light from the doorway, I saw something on his face that I had never seen there before in 62 years of knowing him. My father was not a man who showed weakness. He'd buried a wife, worked himself half to death, raised 2 boys alone, and never once asked anyone for anything. But what I saw on his face in that moment was fear. Raw, helpless, confused fear. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, very quietly, "I didn't know if you were coming back." I don't have words for what that sentence did to me. I called 911. I called Carol. I sat on the edge of his bed and held his hand while we waited for the ambulance, and I talked to him in whatever voice I could manage. I told him I was here. I told him he was going to be okay. He was severely dehydrated. He hadn't eaten a real meal in at least 3 days based on what the paramedics told me later. His blood pressure was dangerously low, partly from dehydration and partly because he'd missed 4 days of medication. The ER doctor told me that another day or two, and we would have been having a very different conversation. Dennis had been gone for at least 5 days. The police took my statement that night. They were kind, professional, asked the right questions. When did I leave? When did I last have contact with my brother? Had my father expressed any concern about Dennis? Did I know where Dennis was currently located? I didn't know where Dennis was. I wouldn't find out until the following morning, and when I did, everything I thought I understood about my brother collapsed completely. I spent the night at the hospital. My father stabilized within a few hours. They got fluids into him and monitored his heart, and by midnight his color had come back, and he was giving the nurses a hard time about the television remote, which I took as a very good sign. I sat in the chair beside his bed, and I didn't sleep. Sometime around 3 in the morning, while my father dozed, I picked up my phone and did something I should have done sooner. I opened the banking app for the joint account I shared with my father. We'd set it up 2 years earlier when he was first diagnosed, so that I could manage his bills and expenses without him having to deal with the complications. His Social Security deposits went there. His pension check. His savings. The account had $211,000 in it the last time I'd checked. The balance was $4,800. I sat in that hospital chair and stared at my phone screen for what felt like a very long time. Then I went through the transaction history. Wire transfer, wire transfer, wire transfer, ATM withdrawal, wire transfer. 14 separate transactions over the course of 9 days, almost all of them for amounts just under $10,000 a detail, that would later become significant when the FBI explained to me that this is called structuring, a deliberate attempt to avoid the automatic reporting threshold that banks use for large cash transactions. Dennis had been planning this before I ever left for Raleigh. The detective assigned to our case was a woman named Hargrove, and she was the one who explained to me over the following days exactly how my brother had done it. Dennis had arrived at the house 3 days before I left. He'd told me he wanted to come early, get settled, spend some time with our father. I'd thought it was touching. I'd thought maybe he was finally stepping up. What he'd actually been doing was observing, learning my father's routines, figuring out where documents were kept, getting my father comfortable and relaxed, and trusting in a way that was designed to look like brotherly affection. The power of attorney document had been notarized the day after I left for Raleigh. My father could not clearly remember signing it. His Parkinson's affected his cognition some days more than others, And the notary, a woman later charged as an accessory, had apparently been paid by Dennis to process the document without the standard verification procedures. My father, medicated and trusting and believing completely that his son would never hurt him, had signed something he didn't understand, while Dennis sat beside him and told him it was just routine paperwork, just something to make things easier for all of us while things were in flux. With that power of attorney, Dennis had access to everything. He'd transferred $175,000 out of my father's savings account over 9 days. He'd also applied for a home equity line of credit using the power of attorney and my father's home as collateral, the house my father had owned outright since 1987, the house he'd paid off with 30 years of mill work. Dennis had borrowed $60,000 against it. That money was also gone. The wire transfers had gone to an account in my brother's name at a bank in Florida. By the time investigators froze that account, approximately $40,000 remained in it. The rest had been moved again through a series of transactions that the Financial Crimes Unit spent weeks trying to untangle. Some of it appeared to have been converted to cash. Some of it was spent. A significant portion had been transferred to a second account that investigators believed Dennis had opened under a slightly altered version of his name. Dennis himself, when the police went to his apartment in Knoxville, was gone. He had cleared out his apartment. His furniture was still there, but his personal items, his clothing, his passport gone. His car was found 3 days later at a long-term parking garage near Nashville International Airport. Investigators found a one-way ticket to Cancun purchased the morning he left my father's house. He'd had this planned the entire time. From the moment I called him and asked for his help, he had been building a plan to use that window. My absence, my father's vulnerability, my trust. There are moments in your life when something you believed about the world just ceases to be true. Not gradually, the way most things change, but all at once, like a light switching off. My brother, the man I'd grown up with, the one who'd been the best man at my wedding, the one my father's eyes lit up for every time he walked into a room, that man had looked at our father as an opportunity. He'd seen an elderly, trembling, trusting old man who couldn't always remember what day it was, and he had made a calculation. He'd decided our father's life was worth less than $235,000, and then he'd left him there to die. That is not an exaggeration. The detective, Hargrove, told me directly that given my father's condition and medication regimen, the timeline they were working with suggested my father would have gone into a medical crisis within 48 hours of when I found him. His blood pressure had already been dangerously low. His kidneys were beginning to strain from the dehydration. Without intervention, the outcome would have been different. I asked her directly. I needed to hear it said plainly whether what Dennis had done constituted attempted murder. She was measured in her answer, the way investigators are when they're being careful. She told me that the district attorney's office would be looking at the full scope of charges. She told me that in Tennessee, a charge of attempted murder requires proof of specific intent to cause death, that prosecutors would need to demonstrate that Dennis had actively planned and intended for my father to die, not merely that his abandonment created conditions that could have led to death. The distinction, she explained, was difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. What they could prove was criminal neglect of a vulnerable adult, felony financial exploitation, elder abuse, fraud, and several federal charges related to the wire transfers and the structuring. I want to be honest. That answer made me angry. It still makes me angry. My father spent 7 days alone, unable to reach a phone, unable to get his medications, slowly getting weaker and more confused and more frightened, and the man responsible was looking at criminal neglect rather than attempted murder. I understand why the law is structured the way it is. I even understand intellectually the difference between negligence that creates deadly risk and active intent to kill. But my father was 78 years old with Parkinson's disease, and Dennis left him there knowing exactly what that meant. The district attorney's office ultimately charged Dennis with 12 counts, including aggravated financial exploitation of an elderly person, criminal neglect causing serious bodily harm, identity fraud, wire fraud, and federal structuring charges. The federal charges alone carried significant sentencing weight. Dennis was apprehended 6 weeks later in Guadalajara, Mexico. It took another 4 months before he was extradited back to the United States, a process that I watched unfold from a distance with a kind of hollow patience. My father came home from the hospital after 4 days. I want to tell you what those first few weeks were like, because I think it matters. My father did not talk about Dennis for almost 3 weeks after he came home. He sat on the back porch in the mornings, the way he always had, with his coffee, looking out at the yard, and he was quiet in a way that was different from his normal quiet. There was something weighted in it. I didn't push him. Carol came down from Raleigh once her sister was stable enough, and she cooked for him and sat with him in the evenings, and I think that helped more than anything I could have said. One morning, about 3 weeks in, I came out to the porch with my own coffee and sat down next to him. We were quiet for a while, the way we often were. Then my father said, without looking at me, I kept asking him to call you. He told me you were busy. He told me you'd come when you could. I didn't say anything. My father said, I want you to know I believed him. I believed he was taking care of it. I told my father I knew that. I told him it wasn't his fault. He was quiet again for a minute. Then he said, I keep trying to figure out when he became someone who could do that. I keep thinking I missed something. I told him I'd been asking myself the same question. He nodded slowly. He took a sip of his coffee. And then he said something that I have thought about almost every day since. I don't think you miss it. I think some people just decide. He tapped his temple with one finger. They decide. And once they decide, it was always going to happen. I don't know if he's right about that. I've spent a lot of time thinking about Dennis, about the loans he'd mentioned over the years that never quite materialized into explanations, about the hints of financial stress he'd dropped, and then walked back, about the way he'd asked me twice in the year before everything happened whether I knew what our father's estate was worth. I'd thought he was just being practical. I'd thought he was thinking about the future the way reasonable adults do. Maybe the decision was made long before I made that phone call. Maybe I just provided the opportunity. The civil case moved faster than the criminal case in some ways. Our attorney, a woman named Bridget Callahan in Nashville, who specialized in elder financial abuse, filed suit against the notary who had processed the fraudulent power of attorney, against the bank that had failed to flag the structuring pattern in the wire transfers, and against Dennis personally. The argument about the home equity line of credit was particularly strong, and it was the one that our attorney was most confident about. Because the power of attorney had been obtained through fraud and coercion, she argued, any financial instruments executed using it were legally void. The bank had processed a home equity loan against a property belonging to a man who had not meaningfully consented to anything. That contract, she told us, should never have existed. She was right. The bank, facing significant exposure and unwilling to go to trial on facts that were going to look very bad in front of a jury, settled. The $60,000 home equity debt was extinguished. My father's house was clear again. The $175,000 in wire transfers was a different and harder fight. Of the $40,000 that had been frozen in Dennis's account when investigators moved quickly, approximately $37,000 was eventually returned through the criminal forfeiture process. The rest, the money that had been moved, converted, spent, was largely gone. Some additional funds came through the settlement with the bank, which included a separate payment in acknowledgement of their failure to flag the suspicious transaction patterns. In the end, my father recovered somewhere between $85,000 and $90,000 of the $175,000 that had been taken. It wasn't everything. It wasn't close to everything, but it was real. Our attorney told us that for elder financial fraud cases, that recovery rate was actually better than average. Most families, she said, recover nothing. Most of the money is gone before anyone notices, and the perpetrator has nothing left to seize. I keep that in mind when I start to feel angry about what wasn't recovered. I try to keep that in mind. Dennis's criminal trial was 8 months after his extradition. I attended every day. Carol came with me for the first 2 days and for the verdict. My father did not come. He told me he didn't need to see it. He told me he'd said everything he needed to say in the victim impact statement that our attorney helped him prepare, and that he didn't want to sit in a room with Dennis for 2 weeks and watch lawyers argue about what had happened to him. I respected that completely. The victim impact statement, read aloud in court by our attorney, because my father had asked not to speak himself, was 2 pages long. I had read it before, helped him shape a few sentences, sat with him while he worked through it. But hearing it read in that courtroom, in the formal silence of a federal proceeding, was something different. My father had written, in his plain and careful way, about what it had felt like to lie in his own bed for 7 days, not knowing if anyone was coming. About calling out and hearing nothing. About the moment when he'd stopped being sure that he was going to be all right. About what it meant to be 78 years old and realize that the person you had trusted with your safety had decided you didn't matter. He'd written, "I am not angry that my son wanted my money. I understand that people get into trouble and make wrong choices. What I cannot understand, and what I will not forgive, is that he left me alone in that house, knowing what might happen. He knew my condition. He knew what missing those medications meant. He knew I couldn't reach the phone from my bed. He knew all of it, and he left anyway. That is not a wrong choice. That is a choice to let your father die." The jury convicted on 11 of the 12 counts. Dennis was sentenced to 19 years in federal and state prison, sentences to run consecutively on the most serious charges. The judge, a man named Alderman who looked to be about my father's age, made a point of speaking at length during sentencing about the particular vileness of crimes committed against elderly and vulnerable people by those entrusted with their care. He said, and I wrote this down because I wanted to remember it exactly, that the legal system drew a distinction between negligence and murder for good reason, but that the moral weight of what had been done in this case was not diminished by the legal classification. He looked directly at Dennis when he said that. Dennis looked back at the judge with the same expression he'd worn for most of the trial, a kind of flattened blankness, like a man who had decided the only way through was to feel nothing. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at our father's chair, which sat empty in the gallery with a printed copy of the victim impact statement on the seat. He was 48 years old. With good behavior, he would be eligible for parole consideration when he was 68. My father was not in the courtroom when the sentence was read. He was at home, on the back porch, drinking his morning coffee. I drove straight from the courthouse to his house, still in my suit, and I came around the side of the house and sat down next to him. He looked at me when I sat down. He read my face the way fathers do. He said, 19 years? I told him yes. 19 years. He nodded once, slowly. He looked back out at the yard. After a moment, he said, "Does that feel like enough to you?" I thought about it honestly. I told him I didn't know if enough was the right question. I told him the man who had done this to him would be an old man himself before he breathed free air, and that the house was his free and clear, and that we'd gotten back what we could. My father was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it." I told him I was listening. He said, "You drove 7 hours in the middle of the night because you had a feeling something was wrong. You didn't wait. You didn't talk yourself out of it. You just came." He paused. "I need you to know I know that. I knew it lying in that bed. Even when I wasn't sure you were coming. I knew that if anyone was coming, it was you." I did not manage to say anything for a moment. My father said, "That's worth more to me than 19 years in a courtroom." He patted my hand once. My father, who had never been an expressive man, who had marked 30 years of raising me, mostly through presence and reliability and showing up, he patted my hand and then he picked up his coffee again and looked out at the yard. "I have been asked, since all of this became something people around town knew about, whether I have any advice for people in similar situations. Whether there's anything I would tell someone who has an elderly parent, who is sharing financial accounts, who has a sibling they maybe don't know as well as they thought they did. I have a few things I tell people. The first is, a power of attorney is one of the most powerful legal documents a person can sign, and it should never be signed without the person's attorney present, full stop. Not a notary, not a family member's suggestion, not in a casual moment at the kitchen table, an attorney, every time. The second is, if someone has access to a bank account that holds another person's savings, set up transaction alerts. Every bank offers this. You can get a text or an email for any transaction over a certain amount. It takes 5 minutes and it would have changed everything in our case. The third is, trust your feeling when something is wrong. I knew on day 8 when the text stopped. I talked myself out of it for almost 2 days because I didn't want to believe what I was afraid of. Those 2 days almost cost my father his life. When the feeling is there, move. The fourth is something harder to say, but I believe it's true. You cannot protect an elderly parent from every kind of betrayal, and you cannot blame yourself for trusting the people who are supposed to be trustworthy. What happened to my father was not caused by anything I did wrong. It was caused by a decision. Dennis made a decision, as my father said. That was probably made long before I picked up the phone. The responsibility belongs entirely to the person who made that choice. My father is 79 now. His Parkinson's has progressed some, the way it does, but slowly. His hands shake more than they used to. He uses a cane on the bad days. He still gets up every morning and sits on that back porch with his coffee, and he still gives the nurses a hard time when I take him to his appointments, and he still makes the same 3 or 4 jokes he has always made, and every single time they still make me laugh. I still live 4 miles away. I still check in every day. I still stock his refrigerator and organize his medications and make his chili recipe on Sunday afternoons better than Dennis's, he reminds me, which I take as the highest possible compliment. We don't talk about Dennis much. When his name comes up, my father acknowledges it and moves on. The way he's always handled hard things, not by pretending they didn't happen, but by refusing to let them become the whole story. He has told me once, and only once, that he hopes Dennis uses the time to figure out when he made the decision, and whether he could have made a different one. He said it without bitterness. I'm not sure I have that kind of grace in me, but I'm working on it. Some mornings I sit on that porch with him and we drink our coffee and don't say much, and I think about what it would have meant to drive up to that house and find what I was afraid I was going to find. I think about the version of this story where I waited one more day. I think about what it would have been like to stand in that kitchen and understand that I was too late. And then I look over at my father, at his hands around his mug, at the way he tilts his face up a little when the morning light comes through the trees, and I let that version of the story go, because it isn't this version. This version, he's here. This version, I came when something told me to come. That's the only version that matters now.